already the External Affairs
Yes.
Minister. So this is writing as the External Affairs Minister. The minister says, it was unsettling to discover after 4 decades as a professional diplomat that many of the assumptions on which we had operated were now being called into question. And later on, of course, in the book, you talk about the dogmas of Delhi and so forth and all. In what way the assumptions were coming into question? What were the Delhi dogmas that perhaps were probably the subject of this questioning?
Well, you know, if you look, we are now marking 75 years of our independence. Okay. So what we call Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. And 75 years, I mean, any kind of round number or you know, 25, 50, 75, these are good occasions actually to reflect. Okay. Now, writing a book is also a good occasion to reflect because it's like a self-audit. And the reason why I wrote that was because foreign policy and diplomacy is a certain, there are a certain set of people over a period of time who determine and decide what is right, what is wrong, what is smart, what is not, and they have a view of the world, okay, on which, and that's the assumptions that they make. Now, the reason I wrote that, which is questioning the assumptions, was that the world has changed so much, and the opportunities for India and the challenges for India have correspondingly been impacted. That the assumptions we would have had 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago are today challenging. And if the book was written really as an exercise in provocation, you know, which is read the book and argue with me. And I actually, what I did was each chapter of the book in some forum, I took that chapter, it could be a university, it could be a business forum, it could be a closed group. So I did some variant of that book and then sat and, you know, argued with people and then, you know, kind of put those points into it as well. So it was very kind of dialectical as an exercise. I give you a very simple example. Take our attitude towards the United States. If you look at the attitude towards the United States between late 40s and I would say 2000, I take that as a year, the year Clinton came to India. For almost 50 years, due to various reasons, I'm not saying we were at fault or the US were at fault, the fact was we regarded the US with suspicion, with a lot of wariness. There was a very substantive relationship. But the overall, you know, the foreign policy assessment of the US was of deep caution, if not of deep suspicion. Now the fact is, when the world began to change, the tenability of that view, I think, came into question. Now, we struggled. I mean, even the nuclear deal in 2005, 2008 was a struggle because on the one hand, the US was offering some very clear advantages. What held us back was an innate, historical, deeply rooted, possibly validated suspicion of the United States. So we kind of said, well, you know, there's a gift horse, maybe we really need to look it in the mouth. So it has taken us actually a lot of effort to overcome the earlier assumptions in order to forge a different relationship with the United States. And one of the big differences which really Prime Minister Modi has made is because on this relationship he has not carried ideological baggage. He is not a person, you know, who's rooted in a certain worldview which makes you fundamentally sort of distant from the US. He's been very practical and outcome oriented and done a cost-benefit analysis and found various, you know, convergences with the US. So you've seen actually remarkable progress in the last 8 years. But you would not have had that if you're not prepared to challenge the assumptions which held us back earlier.
So, to what degree do you think India's economic failures, especially during the first 4 decades, limit our ability to assume a more significant role internationally? And here I want to draw a little bit of comparison with China. Now, China was also during these decades kind of as much of failure as India was economically. Yet it seems that somehow China was able to pull its weight a little more than we were able to.
That's an understatement, but yes. No, seriously, I mean, they are today 5 times your economy.
Yes.
So I think it's
No,
more
today
than a
it is,
little more.
But even if we look back, pre-2000, let's say, or
Okay.
pre-1995, at least one gets the sense that the Chinese were able to pull their weight in those decades a bit more than we were able to. Why was there this difference, even though we were a democracy and the Chinese were obviously an authoritarian regime?
Well, I've sort of addressed that in the book. I've attributed, again, this is a retrospective look free of judgment. It's an analysis rather than a blame game. I think there were 3 big things which went wrong for us. One was, of course, at the start, the partition. The second was the delay in exercising the nuclear option. And the third was the delay in the economic reforms. So China not only did not get partitioned, actually China grew in this period territorially. China exercised its nuclear option early, 1964. We did a half-hearted move in 74. We did it, but we didn't do it, so we had to do it all over again in 98. And that's 74 was tough enough, but by the time you stretched it to 98, you actually created a big burden on yourself and also allowed Pakistan to catch up in that period. And of course, for me, the most serious was really the economic reform, because if you look, China, you can say, embarked on its economic reform pretty much after Mao died. So by 1980, 79, China was very clearly set on a course of economic reform. It took us another decade plus. But there's a very big difference also. Here's the paradox. Precisely because China, in a sense, was during the Cultural Revolution period, the Great Leap Forward Cultural Revolution period, China pretty much it did itself so much economic damage during that period that there were no vested interests left by the time the late 70s came, who bitterly opposed those reforms. So, in a sense, once the Chinese leadership said we are going down this path, because they were in a worse situation than they were, it was easier for them and more decisive for them to go down that path. In our case, we delayed it by a decade plus. Then there were interests which kind of continued that debate and slowed down that reform. So we never had that sort of clean slate ability to progress with China. So it's not just China had a head start of a decade. China also had a pathway which was much more obstacle-free than it was for us. And then I would argue, in many ways, China had a better strategy. Because to me, it's not just that we did 1991, 92 and said, okay, now great, we are launched. I do believe, and I think you and I don't entirely agree on this aspect of it, that our model of of embracing the world was deeply flawed. We did not build our domestic supply chains, we did not support our small and medium industries. We thought the world economy would be fair to us, and therefore the more we exposed ourselves to the global economy, the more we would progress, we would become competitive. I think the reality was that the world economy was full of players who were not market economies, who gamed the world trading rules, who actually, in a sense, used their practices to fundamentally disadvantage our businesses. So we are one of the few economies where our own companies do not get a level playing field. So, so late start, no clean pathway, a lot of domestic lack of support, not the right vision. I think these were all factors, and I think today correcting that, I mean, to me, the Atmanirbhar Bharat is not a slogan. It is actually a corrective of a flawed model of globalization that we pursued for more than 2 decades, and I think which has not served our country well.
I think you're right. We will disagree on the second part of it. But let me emphasize on the first part. I think that I completely agree that very spot on. That the way I put it to my students in the classroom is that, socialism and democracy interacted very differently than socialism and authoritarianism did in China. In India, because of democracy, it was much harder to change, and the opposite kind of forces really came through.
I'm not being a contrarian, but I might even challenge that. I mean, not historically. I don't believe being a democracy is an obstacle. I don't believe it's a disadvantage. I mean, look, I'm just giving you the last 3 years, okay? 3 years which I have seen as a politician and a minister, and I look at what has happened in India in the middle of COVID. And when I see the pace of change in India, the fact that we have been able to create a social safety net, that the Indian system today can day after day look after 800 million people, 2.5 times the population of this country in terms of their food requirements, that we can put bank money into the accounts of 400 million people. The fact that today we can actually create a health system which people felt is something which a low-income economy cannot do. The fact that we built 25 million houses, and if you take average size of 4.8 as a family size in India, that means you really given houses, home ownership to 100 million people. And all of this is done in a democracy. So I think sometimes, democracy has been used as a cop-out for bad governance.
Yeah, I don't think, I disagree on that side, that part. I think in the fact of this that, somehow coalition politics is in the way and so forth, I think was used. That part I'll agree with you. But nevertheless, the pace of change in India has been clearly much slower in terms of policy. Democracy per se is not in the way, but you do need a leader at the top who is willing to really take the risk.
Yeah. And I think democracy can deliver such a leader, and is delivering such a leader.
Yes, it can, but more often than not, whereas in the Chinese authoritarian system, once Deng Xiaoping took the view that, look, the old way is out, new way is coming through, I think he could really bring about the change in a much more forceful way. And certainly you'll agree that in democracy you got to build up some consensus, and particularly if the leaders at the top are not fully driven to the change will be slower. I think that certainly that has been our experience. That I'll mention, for example, just one example. Take the labor law reforms. It has been recognized for 30 years, and it took Prime Minister Modi to finally get them passed through the Parliament. Even on farm laws, in the end, it was a very courageous move on the part of the central government. But in the end, politics led us to withdraw those. Whereas I think in an authoritarian system, those sorts of things carry through.
No, look, I'd put it this way. I think at the end of the day, it should not be authoritarian systems deliver and democracies don't. Yeah. Because I can turn to another neighbor who's been largely authoritarian for the same period, the one on the west. If you'd like the one on the east, you can take that as well. And I would argue that their authoritarian regimes have actually completely screwed up their economy. So you cannot make a correlationship between progress and authoritarianism. It's a kind of determinism, and which is not your intention, I know.
No,
but I would enter that caveat saying at the end of the day, you need a leadership, you need a vision, you need the ability to implement, and maybe democracy makes it harder. I think it makes it more sustainable. Perhaps a more diverse society needs a democracy. It is harder to do through a more authoritarian way. So I just feel at times the direction of the argument leads us to beat up on democracy more than democracy deserves. And I think somebody needs to defend democracy.
Absolutely. No, there's no issue with that. I completely agree that and we are in fact one of the examples in the 17 years from 2003 to 2019-20. India has grown 7.5%. I think this is a very little kind of advertised and very little known fact. But for a 17-year period, the growth rate has been 7.5%. And that probably is the fastest so far for a democracy. So we have actually ourselves done that. So with that, I think what has happened now in the last 15 years or so. So 2007, I checked, we were 12th largest economy globally, and we have now become the 5th largest. Big difference. I think perhaps setting aside China, that is the steepest climb that any economy has had in terms of the global rankings and all. How much you think that has been helpful in bringing India? I mean, I sort of think back, 2008, I wrote a book, India, the Emerging Giant, the title.
I remember that.
And Steve Cohen, who was political scientist, he's no more a political scientist at Brookings Institution, he would say that, well, it looks like India is always emerging but never arriving. But I now feel that actually if I had to write a similar book, the title would have to be very different. It is a country that now very much on the global scene. How much do you think it is the economy, and how much it is a bit of rebranding also of India internationally by Prime Minister Modi?
No, I don't think it's rebranding. I mean, rebranding would not be sustainable if the reality did not support it. At the end of the day, any product is as good. The reputation of a product is as good as a product. I mean, you can add a delta factor, but it can't be dramatically different. I do think, and I can make comparisons over multiple decades. I mean, today the fact that we are the 5th largest economy, how we have come through COVID, how we are today dealing with the headwinds of the Ukraine conflict, how we have actually transitioned into the digital era. I think these are all how in fact our diaspora and their successes have changed the perception of India in the world. I think it's a accumulation of multiple factors, but at the end of the day, you should give the world this credit. The world's a very hard-headed place. Nobody kind of buys sort of a spiel. I mean, people test you out through policies and practices and your decisions. And when people today do see, in a difficult situation, India responds. We have today, certainly in our part of the world, developed that image of a first responder. Nepal earthquake happens, Yemen civil war happens. I've seen during Ukraine. I mean, a whole lot of my fellow foreign ministers actually have told me that they were following who could evacuate out of Ukraine. Now, the fact that we did 20,000 was for them staggering number. There were people who were struggling to do 200. So there is a performance evaluation. I think the world's a very competitive place, and within this, roughly 200 countries of the world, they do track each other. They do exchange views. They do judge you by, your crisis response, your non-crisis response. They do judge you by your ability to take stands. So if you are part of a grouping, it's a kind of run-of-the-mill, okay, you are one more of a herd, versus your ability to stand your ground or to say, well, I think this this is what should be or should not be. I think all those things matter. And definitely, I would say, compared to where we were earlier, as a foreign minister, it is a huge advantage for me to represent a country which is in a much stronger position than it has ever been. On the other hand, as I had the occasion to tell someone during my book release, a Gujarati book release, I said, look, I would envy the person. They asked me what would be the world in 2047. So I said, I have no idea, but I envy the person who would have my job in 2047. So because, you know, I can see the trajectory, and the world respects that. So at the end of the day, it's a mix, but finally the economics is key. I mean, if you ask me in all of this, nuclear matters enormously, but if you tell me, okay, out of all the variables, pick one. If you had a chance to, saying one domain you really want to put everything into it, no question, I would put it into the economics.
So the way the economic situation looks to me, the person in 2047 may not have to envy you too much, because a lot of this will happen in the next 6 or 7 years. And let me just give you the background of why I said this. I think, well, today we are already 5th largest. A lot of restructuring has happened in the last 2 or 3 years in the economy. The way it looks, I mean, that's an area I sort of know and understand well. And the way it looks to me is that the kind of restructuring that had happened during the last few years of Prime Minister Vajpayee, with a massive kind of macroeconomic reforms, the recapitalization of the banks, and you know, and that led to this massive investment cycle, which really carried the economy ultimately to about 8% plus growth for several years. I think something very similar to me, you know, we'll see how it unfolds, and I may prove wrong, but something very similar is underway currently. First, the restructuring has happened. You begin to see the signs now, you know, the kind of recovery that we have seen in this last quarter, for which the data came. The economy jumped 13.5%. It comes on a low base, but still 13.5% in a quarter is quite unprecedented. Unemployment figures actually completely reinforce that. India now at last putting out the unemployment figures at fairly fast pace and in a timely fashion. So we have unemployment rate, urban unemployment rate for the quarter, same quarter, which is the second quarter of 2022. It is the lowest actually since 2017-18, when this periodic labor force survey got started. Investment rate during that quarter is about 34.5% of the GDP, quite unprecedented in the last about 15-20 years. So all the indicators I see suggest to me that now the economy is really about to take off. My calculation is that it will take another 6, maybe 7 years for India to actually get to the 3rd largest economy. At that point, you know, of the 3 largest economies, 2 largest will be developing countries. 3 out of 4 largest economies will be in Asia. So it seems to me that, you know, what you are perhaps thinking might happen in 2047 is not very far away. It is going to happen, at least economically, and that's where I want to sort of get your comments on, you know, how you see this is going to impact, because you will still be the External Affairs Minister at the time.
Well, I don't know about that, but look, I think those are very sound points you have made. But in addition to that, I can think of the, you know, the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. So I can imagine that in the course of this decade, there will be factors, good and bad, which we have not actually calculated upon. I mean, look at the problems we are facing today. I mean, if I told you even a year ago that we would be worrying about not just the price, but actually the availability of fuel, of food, of fertilizer. Nobody would have thought this. So the beauty of history is it's very hard to anticipate. So I would be optimistic, no question about it. I also feel the kind of domains which would kick in would actually help India more. I definitely see in many ways a much more intensively digital world. It is really how much of a role it has in shaping your everyday life, shaping governance. And I think many of these, India would embrace those changes much more naturally. It's that, in a sense, the least developed has the least to lose in embracing change. Mm-hmm. So we have shown in many areas we've actually been very fast embracers of change, which is very different from that initial economic period where I was comparing India and China. China embraced that change in the 1980s because it had less to lose. So I see your point. I share your optimism. I have no question by the end of the decade we would be in a very different place. But I would still say you are hitting about third gear out there. It's really when your incomes, per capita income starts to go to a much higher level. Today we are still at what, $2,000. When you
2020.
Yes.
When you hit 2,200.
Yeah. So when you start hitting the 10,000 plus zone, as China has done, then it's a really different ball game.
Okay, let me just ask one more question, and then we'll open it to the audience here. So a return to your book, and this is how you describe, I think, the strategy. This is a time for us to engage America, manage China, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support.
That's exactly what I'm doing. That's in essence what we've been doing. Mind you, it's not been easy. Managing China hasn't been easy. Reassuring Russia hasn't been easy. Getting Japan into play hasn't been easy. So, those are the natural challenges of a changing world. But I was trying for a kind of a lay reader really to sum up the multiple directions which we would have to address in different ways. So, life diplomacy is not linear, it's not unifocal. It's also not a zero-sum game. It's sometimes people think if this relationship is moving better, that means that relationship must be worse. That need not be the case. I think a lot of that depends on our strategy and our skills. So the thrust of what I was projecting was a kind of a development along multiple axes towards multiple centers, multiple poles, multiple regions. And that requires an enormous dexterity. That it's like having multiple balls up in the air and you've got to keep it going. And, well, I'm really getting into mixed metaphors, but it's like a high trapeze act with multiple balls in the air. And, you've got to keep getting better and better at it if you really want to progress. And in an interesting way, I would suggest that this year has been a demonstration of it. That, we have had challenges in the Indo-Pacific. We've had challenges in Eurasia. We have tried to kind of effectively address both. We are today seen even more strongly than before as speaking up for the interests of the global South. But we are also seen as actually a deeply democratic power which has underlined the values the relevance of democracy, which looks today as in the digital domain at the importance of trust and transparency. We are also seen as a additional engine of growth, which is trying to make supply chains more reliable and resilient. So you have like multiple roles, multiple targets, multiple relationships, and it's like a it's like a 360 which you got to keep doing.
Perfect. Okay, so we'll open up. Just one thing before all of you raise your hands. I really want to give first chance to the Columbia students and faculty. So please, especially if you're from media, don't try to be the first. Just hold your questions. You get chances to ask these questions to the minister in many different forums. So students, all right? Okay, let's come here. Yes. There is microphone. So.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Jaishankar. I wanted to ask you a question in regards to a lot of students who might, like myself, have come, for example, to the US or other countries for their education, perhaps a career that follows. So we come to a point in our lives where we've had to face this very difficult decision that sometimes we end up being citizens of the countries that we've studied and worked at. In India, currently, a dual citizenship, it does not allow that. So I know there's been some talk of changing that, but nothing substantive yet. So could you shed some light on like what is the reason that students like us have to leave our home countries like in an official way and for like leave our passport, which I personally do not want to do. I'm sure a lot of people don't. So could you tell us like if that is going to change anytime soon, or what is the thought process behind not giving dual citizenship? Thank you so much.
Can we take two more questions?
Yes, absolutely. I can cover more.
More efficient, yeah. Yes. Yes. Vivek, there is one extra microphone you can pick up from there, and maybe somebody can help us.
मंत्री डॉक्टर जयशंकर जी नमस्ते। मेरा नाम संजीत और मैं यहाँ सिपा में मास्टर कर रहा हूँ और मैं प्रोफेसर अरविंद जी का क्लासमेट भी रहता था।
Okay.
और
Question.
ठीक है। अगस्त में आपने तो एशिया सोसाइटी संस्थान के शुभारंभ के अवसर पर आपने टिप्पणी की कि आपने चीन भारत संबंध और एशिया सेंट्रिक में जोर दिया और आपने कहा कि मैनेजमेंट ऑफ कॉन्ट्रडिक्शंस बहुत ज़रूरी है, पर आपने भी कहा कि क्वोट अच्छा है क्योंकि तो क्रॉस रीजनल कोऑपरेशन के लिए, लेकिन लोग मानते हैं कि क्वोट चीन के विरुद्ध करते हैं, इसलिए तो ये कॉन्ट्रडिक्ट आप कैसे संभालेंगे और क्वोट की दृष्टिकोण से भारत का नॉन अलाइंड ट्रेडिशंस हम कैसे समझें एज अ इंटरनेशनल अफेयर स्टूडेंट? धन्यवाद।
Okay, we'll take one more and then.
Should I tell people in English broadly what he said? Basically, the issue was he was referring to something I said in August about India-China relations. How will you manage the contradictions in India-China relations, and really where does non-alignment fit into it?
Okay.
Good morning. Good morning, Doctor. Thank you for your words. I'm from Mexico, and I think economically speaking, our countries are very similar in some aspects. So I would like to hear your opinion on how can we improve economic growth without making inequality get bigger in our countries, which I think is a big issue. Thank you.
Okay. Let the minister answer, and then we'll
Okay.
take one more round. That's all.
Sure. First, on the dual citizenship, I think in a way, governments in India have recognized the dilemma of people like you. So they have started during Prime Minister Vajpayee's time. They have tried to create a particular category which will allow you to be a citizen of another country but yet have a very privileged association with India. So, we started with two, it was a PIO, Persons of Indian Origin card, and the Overseas Citizen of India. So we've now combined it, made it into a single program. So we have to recognize today that the world is a workplace for Indians. and it is very likely in a greater knowledge economy kind of world, more and more Indians will look for jobs abroad or look for study abroad. There are, after all, today more than 1 million Indians who study abroad. So the attempt is to find a middle ground between your predicament and our regulations. Now you'll ask me, therefore, why do you have those regulations? The reason is, if you look at the the challenges, the history of India, the partition, the complexity of what we face, for us to move into dual citizenship is not something which can be readily and easily and securely done. I think there are considerations which would urge caution as well. So it's something people have gone into very deeply. Now, having said all that, by the way, what I know of this country, you can easily work here and prosper here without changing your passport. So that's also a suggestion I would leave with you. Regarding the India-China contradiction, look, it is for me, I look at it from a political science perspective, but also a larger historical perspective. You had, in our times, the biggest change we have seen in the world is the rise of China. No question about it. Okay. Now, what